I want to welcome everyone here today to the Hess Scholar-in-Residence event entitled Where Does Culture Belong? Indigenous Artifacts in Museums and Universities. While this is the last event of the week, in many ways we're trying to circle back to points brought up in the first event with Jaskaran Dillon on Monday regarding Indigenous studies and institutions, and hope it's going to provide a nice closure to this program. But before I begin, I would like to start our discussion off with a land acknowledgement. Brooklyn College sits on unceded territory stolen from the Canarsie and the Nyack, subgroups of the Indigenous Lenape people. That ongoing theft, along with the stolen blood and work of enslaved Africans, facilitates our presence. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and future who have stewarded this land. And we recognize the hundreds of Indigenous nations who continue to resist and uphold their sacred culture. We know that this acknowledgement is neither sufficient nor complete, but is part of a process of learning to become more thoughtful and respectful. It's our wish for a deeper incorporation of Indigenous and Native American cultures, philosophies, and peoples into the curriculum, faculty, student body, and staff of Brooklyn College, in line with our mission to provide a transformative, distinctive education to the whole people of New York City. Before we start, I want to thank Rosamond King and Suklima Roy, whose work through the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities, in cooperation with the Robert L. Hess Scholar-in-Residence Planning Committee, created this program for us today, as well as all the participants here. We have a lot of people still coming in, too, that are joining us via Zoom. And most importantly, I want to thank Winona LaDuke and Nicole Parton-Allygood for their thoughts and words they'll be sharing. It's been such a privilege to be able to attend these events all week and hear Winona's words, and I'm truly honored to be here today to share this sort of Zoom stage with these two amazingly fierce women. So just a little housekeeping before we start. The discussion today will focus on the collection, the curation and interpretation of cultural objects, particularly who has the right to collect, house, and interpret culture in museums and universities. While we ask for everyone to stay muted to facilitate the discussion, we're going to leave time at the end for comments and questions as well. So please place your questions for Winona or Nicole or both through the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And depending upon the time and numbers of questions, we may combine a few depending upon scope and theme. Before I introduce our esteemed guests, I want to introduce myself, who will be serving as moderator for today. My name is Kelly Britt, and I'm an assistant professor of urban archaeology here at Brooklyn College in the anthropology department. I practice a community-based historical archaeology of urban spaces, where I primarily focus on how the past can empower the present through the intersection of materiality and activism. And I'm also interested in how heritage management is conducted both locally and globally. While I've worked on projects in a variety of sectors of archaeology, including museums and for government agencies, where I was privileged to meet Nicole, I am currently working here in Brooklyn with the United Order of Tents, Eastern District 3, the oldest Black women's benevolent society in the United States, to physically and socially preserve their legacy for the African American heritage of the community. Nicole Parton-Allygood is a cultural anthropologist and member of the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma. She's worked with Native American museum collections and also in cultural resource management. She serves her tribe as its Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA officer, or she used to, and as well, she's been the director of the cultural preservation of the Delaware Nation from 2014 to 2020. She lives in Anadarko, Oklahoma on her great-grandmother's original 1902 allotment along the Washita River, and she owns River Rat Consulting LLC, where she works as a consultant. Winona LaDuke probably needs no introductions at this point, but for anyone who's new to the events this week, she is a member of the Ojibwe Band of the Anishinaabe Nation. She's a rural development economist, activist, farmer, and water protector, working on the issues of economic food and energy sovereignty. She lives and works on White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota and leads several organizations, including Honor the Earth, Anishinaabe Agriculture Institute, and Winona's Hemp. She's an international scholar in the areas of climate justice, renewable energy, and environmental justice, and is an esteemed writer of 6 books with 1 more soon to be out. So to set the stage for the discussion today, While we have people from all over joining us in today's discussion, the event was originally geared towards anthropology and art history classes, where students are studying the history and current policies that govern artifacts, and at times ancestral remains and sacred objects. We know these two disciplines are among many that have historical roots in colonialism and racism, and that are only beginning to reckon with this past on many levels. Additionally, many federal laws and museum and university policies have shaped and continue to shape this history, especially the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA, of 1990. As a member of the Anti-Racist Coalition, as many other faculty members are at Brooklyn College, many of us have begun to try to decolonize our classrooms, as was discussed in a previous event this week on colonialism in the classroom. So, using a place-based educational model for today's conversation, we wanted to move from the academic classroom to the museumist classroom and critically discuss this place. While many museum collections, particularly ethnographic ones, were created for a settler colonial project, basically to teach a larger public through materiality of an us versus them worldview, essentially to be dominated or to also dominate others, there's been a growing movement within the museums and other spaces to decolonize these places through acts of repatriation, demonstrations, and protests. In many ways, the pandemic's brought to light the way many of these institutions, including museums and universities, conduct sort of official business and economic business. And they seem to have a version of Wendigo economics, cannibalizing culture and indigenous knowledge for the sake of the tourist dollar. As we've already stated this week, tourism is an extractive industry. Most recently during this pandemic, we've also started to see a shift. Museum workers have been unionizing, especially here in New York City. Patricia Mariquin Norby was named the first full-time Native American Associate Curator of Native American Art at the Met. It took 150 years, but it happened just a few weeks ago. And discussions by museum professionals like those held by the Death to Museum Unconference Dialogue series is starting to discuss how to dismantle the museum as we have known it and try to create something new. So to prepare for today's discussion, some of the students have read Winona's piece, Native Auctions and Buyer Ethics, from her collection of essential writings, Vine Deloria's chapter, Anthropologist and Other Friends, from his book Custard Died for Your Sins, and NAGPRA Comic #1, produced by Sonia Adelaide, Jen Shannon, and John Swager, to understand the basics of NAGPRA. Because this event's geared towards students, I went to them to find out what they wanted to know. So from these readings and current class discussions, students formulated questions surrounding the theme, where does culture belong? And of the questions and topics that we're most interested in hearing from both Winona and Nicole are three major themes. The first is cultural value. Who decides? The second was more about activism and advocacy. And lastly, we're about the laws and the policies regarding repatriation of cultural objects such as NAGPRA and their relationship with objects and ancestors. So while students' questions focus on these three main themes, we are welcome to any sort of topics from participants as well. So to get us grounded, I thought we could start by just talking about cultural value. More precisely, how is this value created and who decides? So the question's directed at both of you. Have either of you seen, either directly or indirectly, a shift of who determines the value of objects in museums and institutions? For instance, has there been a shift from museum administration determining what has the value to more indigenous groups determining the value, either through collaboration, repatriation, etc.? Or even, as Winona's written about, auctioneers. Have you seen some sort of a shift in what is being displayed or sold in these areas? Nicole, would you like to start us off?
I would, thank you. I have seen somewhat of a shift in auction houses, particularly with one out of Minnesota that Winona's probably familiar with, that they're making a greater effort to protect what's coming on the auction block and where it's going, more precisely to see where it came from. for so long, up until the NAGPRA law, interpretation was done by the museum curator, the archaeologist. With the onset of consultation, I have seen a shift in my museum consultations in the past where there is more of an ear. There is more of an acceptance of our interpretations of our own material culture. It still is sometimes met with a bit of skepticism, and that unfortunately depends on the institution that you're working with. Some of the older, more established institutions, like an army that travels on its stomach, they travel on their collection. And in many ways, they're almost maniacally, fiercely protective of it and not wanting to lose that collection. So I've seen small shifts, more so with universities. I'm seeing a really great movement, particularly in the Midwest area of the United States, to be more proactive about repatriation, to be more proactive about consultation. And that gives me a lot of hope. It really does.
Right. Winona, have you seen any shifts?
I've seen some shifts, and I've also seen that there's kind of an ongoing battle on this for sure. Mm-hmm. Just to say, for instance, it's not exactly the same, but a couple of years ago, I don't know if anybody's watching this, the Walker Museum in Minnesota had this piece. I can't remember who the guy was. It's a really great artist, but so what he had was a scaffold. It was really about the death penalty and capital punishment, but he chose to model I think it was like a huge amount of money on this commission from the Walker on the scaffold that was used to hang 38 Dakota in Minnesota. And, that was the largest mass hanging in U.S. history. The same time as Lincoln signed the Emancipation Declaration, they were hung in Mankato, these Dakota people. And so this, that the Walker Museum felt like it was okay. They could just commission a piece and not ask anybody or the Dakotas, really was the arrogance. It really illustrated the arrogance of the industry. And although this is not definitely a university, but it points out kind of the prevalence of that arrogant view. And they were met with a lot of protests. And, in the end, I think the scaffolds were burned. They were forced out. Right? They were burned, right? They were. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but, just like that whole idea that in, 2018, you can erect a scaffold which memorializes the misery of a community. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Call it up. Right. Exactly, call it art. And so, that's been, I think that was kind of a flashpoint in Minnesota. And, now we've seen like a little bit more, resonance. I have seen a lot of rematriation, going on, and really grateful to the people in our communities who have brought our things home. But, a lot of them are still hard-fought battles that have not been won. I mean, my tribe, we have ceremonial drums. They're called big drums. And our drums were held by museums, and churches had them. And, so it's been a slow process for our community. And I think, as a lot of your students know, these are, they're alive in our language. Dwagan is an animate noun. And so these things that are items are actually beings.
Yes.
Right?
They have souls and meanings. Yes.
That is exactly right. And so, we had a museum. It was a university museum, Beloit, Wisconsin, Catholic school, and they had one of our drums. And we asked for it a few times, and they said, "Well, show us that it's yours, and we think it's just a social drum." And we said, "No, it's not a social drum. It's a ceremonial drum, and we know." And so they quarreled with us. And this was about 8 years ago. And then we did get that back, after some pressure. And I heard the story of when our people went to get that drum, and how that drum, you could hear that drum, and they fed that drum and they brought back life. And so, it's still an ongoing process. But with a good NAGPRA officer, we've had Jamie Arsenault up here for a couple of years, highly regarded in NAGPRA world. She is, my reservation was heavily looted.
Yes.
And so, we've seen the beginning of kind of the recovery of more and more. I've been able to see some of those come home. It's circumstantial. You know, I was reviewing this material today again, and because I hear these stories, and you know, I remember the Zuni and Hopi masks at the Paris auction house, right? You probably all studied that? Well, you know, it turns out that they just kept going with those auctions, and the only reason that those masks were returned is because the Annenberg Foundation, which is basically the Reader's Digest fortune, went in and bought those masks and returned them to the people. You know, but the ethics of these auction houses, you know, don't seem to have been, you know, changed too much, and still the dealing in people's cultural, you know, wealth has continued, and certainly the last, you know, case that I've been following, and I wrote about it in my book Recovering the Sacred, is the Berry Museum in Massachusetts, and they have a very large collection of Wounded Knee, you know, clothing that was stripped from the bodies. And I interviewed Audrey Stevens. She passed away, it looks like, in June. And she, you know, she told me this story, like, you know, those people knew that something bad was going to happen, and so they took off their clothes and put them aside before they went to the massacre site. And it's like, how do you come up with a story like that? You know, how do you say that in the middle of winter, people took off their clothes so that their clothes wouldn't be ruined because they were going to be massacred? I was like, you know, so, and I believe that they returned a lock of Bigfoot's hair to his descendants, a lock of hair from a body that was in the collection, but they returned nothing else, you know. And so there's a lot of holding on to stuff still, and it is a sad thing, you know, for our community. It's this loss.
It's almost like an obsession, a disease. We used to have a joke when I was in graduate school. We called it curator's disease, where they begin to think that they own these items, that they are there. And some of them will fiercely fight and argue. And, you know, one of the hardest things for doing repatriation work is proving affiliation. And that onus is on the tribes. When we try to repatriate, we have to prove this. Usually our most reliable method is through geography. We know where our homelands were. You know, my people, I believe there's a quote in one of Catlett's books about the Lenape have been pushed further longer than any other people, because, you know, we made friends with the Dutch, and here we go. But seeing that and knowing that these items are considered priceless, you know, I've had people bring things in and ask me to appraise them. Artifacts from graves that I know were looted from graves, but I can't prove it. And when you tell them these are priceless artifacts, there's no monetary amount to be put on them, it usually angers them or what have you, and they trot on to the next person. And that is so sad, because these are values that are these are our people. These are our ancestors. And I always felt like affiliation was such a hard thing to prove, particularly when instances where you have a burial that's 6 feet away from another one, yet they won't affiliate. The museum won't affiliate because it was dug by someone different or dug at a different time, when it is so obvious. And those things, honestly, I've always thought that NAGPR needs bigger teeth. The penalties need to be stronger. They need to be real penalties to people that loot. They really do.
They really do. Would you mind if I shared an image? I just have one because it came out this August regarding this idea of repatriation and what's actually out there, and still out there, I should say. This is can everyone see? I'll just do.
Oh, yeah.
This is sorry, trying to do this on a small screen is really interesting. I can't, too many things, and not enough space. Hold on. slideshow. That was the button I was looking for.
There we go.
Just so you can see it in a larger space, is that this just came out in August of 2020. And these are, they've noticed that based on data, 56% of Native ancestors are listed in the NAGPRA inventories, but have yet to be published as a notice of inventory completion, meaning they're still held by these institutions. And they're primarily held by 13 institutions. And of these 13 institutions, this idea of not culturally affiliated versus culturally affiliated, so all the blue is supposedly not culturally affiliated, and the orange is the only things that are culturally affiliated. So basically getting to that point that Nicole just brought up.
Yes.
And of these, each one of these institutions holds over 2,000 Native ancestors. And this has been an ongoing problem since the looting started. And I'll just get that off, and I can share that link for others later, because there's a whole article for it as well. But it is an ongoing problem, and the one thing that the students were talking about, since we did read Sonia's wonderful comic, NAGPRA comic #1, and I just recently heard from her, and comic #2 and 3 will be coming out at the end of the year, which is great, is that, you know, this idea of this cultural affiliation is a huge, huge issue. And the laws were written, as we'll talk about a little bit, they're colonial laws, right? They're based in a colonial political framework. So this idea that you have to prove something, and their idea of proof is primarily through particular Western, you know, types of documents. Oral history is finally starting to sort of make it to the table, but it's ridiculous that we're in the 21st century and it's just beginning to be talked about, right? When I was in graduate school and in history classes, I had, you know, graduate students learning history that literally stated oral history is not history. This wasn't that long ago. I mean,
No.
So the fact that that is happening is really, you know, for me, it feels like that's part of the root of the problems, is that just even beginning to think about what, how we see history, how we see what's important needs to shift. And while we can do this in classrooms, the larger public, that's why I like the museum as this classroom, is that needs to shift as well, right? So
Yes.
you both talked about some little shifts that have been happening, but in order to push this forward, do you have any suggestions other than like dismantling all the museums, which we would probably all love to do and start over again? But do you have any other suggestions, particularly for students and other what we would call allies, or as a professor of archaeology, Alexandra Jones, talked about this summer, which I actually like this term better. She was talking at a Black Lives Matter in Archaeology webinar, and she said, don't be an ally. She said, be an accomplice, because an ally can jump at any time, and accomplices are implicated. So I've kind of been taking that sort of as a, how can we step up more? And the students really want to know, especially ones that want to go into this field, how can they actually shift this field? Either of you, if you have any other additional thoughts.
I mean, just to start with, I mean, I don't know if this is necessarily a student. I mean, tribal archives and museums need to be capitalized. You know, we need to bring our lives home. You know, there is no question of the intergenerational trauma that exists in my community, in part associated with all of these pillagers, right, who came in. You know, there's a huge, it's you know, I live and I work in this really challenged situation because of all of this. And I know that when things return, we feel better. And so I think that this overall work to push towards Indigenous peoples having our own collections, you know, then it's a little bit different, because a lot of those things that are collections, there's a couple different pieces. One thing is that some stuff is so toxic in the museum that we can't touch it anymore.
Right.
Like all full of formaldehyde and nasty stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yes.
and you can't, you know, and so that is a complex situation. Some stuff, you know, people don't want back because it's like all weird, you know, but there's a lot of things like people, those need to return to their soil. Like that unaffiliated, like, why you want to hold on to those bodies still? Aren't you done with them? You've measured their femurs already. I mean, I went to see, when I was writing Recovering the Sacred, I went to the Smithsonian. And I went behind, and Bill Billick, I think is his name, took me back there. He was a sweet guy. And I was like, I got to see my people. And I went back there, and there's these green boxes like this big and about, I don't know, 2 feet long. 2.5 feet long, and they just said, you know, white earth, white earth, white earth. And they said, you know, or Ojibwe unaffiliated. It was like boxes and boxes. And I was like, why are they like that? They said they're based on the size of a femur. The people are folded in the size of a femur. That's the longest bone. And so the box is sized for putting the bones in there. And it was just this like boxes of humans. And I thought that's so, you know, they should go home. They should go home, you know, and I've been, you know, I've only seen a couple of these, but you know so you got to capitalize these museums. You bring our people back so they can get returned. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, in the critical, like, I mean, I know I've been to a lot of museums in New York, all kind of stuff, you know, but, you know, figuring out how that dialogue is had, I don't have the answers, but the Lenape, you know, obviously people who are in those museums need to be able to write the narrative, you know, for a lot of it.
You know, the thing is I've sat and done inventories on my ancestors, and you really, when they are your people, that connection is there. They know you're there. I talk to them, I pray with them. Sorry. It's one of the hardest and most fulfilling jobs I have ever done. I was fortunate to be part of 3 repatriations, and finishing those, it's so much work, it's so much emotional, you're exhausted, and it's so important not to do what I'm doing right now when you're consulting. You have to keep it together, because 9 times out of 10 you're dealing with people that don't feel or recognize what you're recognizing as a tribal person working with your ancestors. But once that is completed, the sense of restoring dignity and humanity is probably the best feeling I've ever had as an anthropologist and as an American Indian woman. Sorry, y'all, I gotta have to compose.
Yeah, it's very hard for our communities, you know, this is, and I, you know, really, my prayers are with you, Nicole. You know, I also, you know, I want to tell you like a story, kind of a, you know, so the Smithsonian has a, you know, it's not a sacred item. It fell through the cracks. There's a lot of those, right? So what they have is they have a 2,500 pound boulder of copper. It's called the Ontonagon Boulder, and I thought they long ago smelted it. It's like this legendary and epic copper piece that they took, and they tried to get it a few times. They couldn't get it out, and then they finally hauled it off by, you know, to the Smithsonian. I went and saw it, and you know, it's so heavy. This is at the DC Smithsonian. It's so heavy that they put it in an elevator shaft and put a tarp over it. You know, because it's so heavy, there's no place structurally in the building to keep it. I say, you should just send it back to us. Yeah. And they're like, no, we have to, you know, I mean, we have to keep this. It's a rock. It's a rock. You know, and so I went over there, I do my little feast with it, but they're like, you know, we can't display it. It's too big. I said, they said we'd have to take out one of the Easter Island heads to move it. I was like, y'all need to let go. You know, y'all need to let go. But I talked to them like a few times. They're like, well, you know, it's not really, it falls through the hole because it's not a sacred site, and it's not, and doesn't fall under NAGPRA. And I was like, so, you know, And for us at our ceremonies, that'd be a good thing to have that. That's like one of our sacred places. They took it and put
Yes, and relocated
I just don't get them, you know. I don't get their whole gig, you know, frankly.
And like you said, there are so many. NAG prohibits any further research. Let these people come home. For some tribes, it is a question of, particularly for mine, we had to work really hard to find places within our homelands that we could securely bury. I didn't want to bring my ancestors who lived and died in the New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania area to Oklahoma. They'd never been here. How could they rest here? They needed to go home where they were from. That's one of the biggest obstacles for NAGPRA, is securing a place where we can rebury our ancestors in our homelands, for those of us that are removal tribes, where we know they'll never be bothered again. Sometimes if they came off Park Service land, we can use Park Service land or Forest Service land. But it's a challenge all the time. One thing I was going to speak to is, you know, we were talking about making that affiliation. I am a graduate of one of the universities on that list, and the majority of folks in that institution are affiliated, but there is an issue between taking all of them or just taking the affiliated, and no one seems to be able to iron that out. So that's why those folks are sitting there. Yeah. And that's an issue for so many of us that, you know, we're halfway across the continent from where we started out, and there's just very little places. We've reburied in Ohio, Pennsylvania, on Ellis Island. It's just very hard to secure places and make sure that nobody will be disturbed again. So for anyone that's looking, any of you students that want to go on and do this, familiarize yourself with the NAGPRA laws inside and out. If you want to work for a tribe, I would encourage you to, but I would also encourage you to be respectful and learn tribal traditions and tribal ways. That is tantamount to it. Work in museums if possible. I would love to see a program, Winona, someday where tribes and museums came together and created a position strictly for a NAGPRA rep from the tribe to work with the museum on collections that are being up for repatriation. Because so many times what we hear on the tribal side from the museums is we don't have enough staff.
Right.
We don't have the people to get this done. Well, if we could work out some kind of scholarship or internship or something of that nature where tribal folks that were interested in doing this work could work within those museums to get those repatriations together and out the door, that would be so beneficial. It would also be beneficial to interpretation. We could have people in our museums to interpret our things and get them home. Excuse me, dogs, to interpret them for exhibit, but also to know what's there and identify it and start bringing them home. And us work on building our own museums. Even if we do collaborations, Oklahoma City's doing an American Indian Center that's going to be, we've been working on it for years. I think it's finally going to come to fruition. But the idea was to keep exhibits moving in and out of it, representing all the tribes that were relocated here. So there's ideas and there's plans. It's just getting them into motion and, you know, getting a student body that's interested in doing this work and working with tribes and getting our Indian students interested in doing this. I would love to see scholarship programs for Indian students that wanted to go into anthropology and museums, because the best anthropologists are those of us that are Indian. And I'm not just saying that to be ugly, but we can do more for our own people as we taking up those kinds of studies as well as everything else. I'm kind of running off there, but I think you get the gist of what I'm saying is, is to lift those kids up and encourage them to do this kind of work, to bring back their culture, to take it back. So.
Thanks, Nicole. Rosamond, I think you said there's some questions that we can go to the audience for.
Yeah, there's a few questions that are kind of linked. So Julia was asking kind of a basic question: what are the current penalties under NAGPRA? Because Nicole Alligood talked about how the penalties need to be beefed up. So what are the current penalties? And Monty Stewart asked, should museums replace stolen objects with replicas? And they give an example of the Lascaux cave, which was replaced with a replica in a museum so that prehistoric cave paintings wouldn't be damaged. And then Professor Ball has a question about whether objects in culturally affiliated collections are displayed differently than the way that we might see those objects displayed at the Met or at the Peabody.
Displayed differently with tribal museums?
Yeah.
Or, yeah, you would see a different interpretation. Oftentimes there may be things that are on exhibit that shouldn't be in mainline museums that you will not see in tribal museums. There is definitely a different interpretation and presentation between what you would see interpreted by a museum curator that's non-native versus a native curator. And as far as NAGPRA having more teeth, right now it's a question of fines, very limited jail time. We have a lot of looting in the Texas area out here. And so far, everything I've read coming out of Texas, they're fining them. And we're not talking substantial fines, maybe top end 1,500. So it's not very discouraging at all.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously looting occurs around the world.
Yes.
It's not just a North American indigenous, problem. It's there's huge collections being looted in wars right now, right?
Yep.
So it's really an ongoing trauma. I want to say that there's a really good museum in our area, the Mille Museum, owned by the tribe. It's affiliated with the Minnesota Historical Society Museum, but I've seen this work to bring things back to these museums, and in that they bring those items out. There's a lot of important stuff that happens, and so that transition towards rematriation, and there are different, there's an different approach sometimes. I've only been to a few native museums. There are not that many. The Zuni Museum, but there's a number of them.
There's a few. Interestingly, out here we have the post Fort Sill, which is one of the main training facilities, and where Geronimo was kept. That's about 30 miles from my house, southwest. And the curator that was there for several years was Chickasaw. And there is a drum there that he had such a good relationship with the Kiowas, Comanches, and Apaches that they allowed him to keep this drum so it could be kept preserved and taken care of. But whenever they had ceremony, they could come and pick it up and go do their ceremony, do what they needed to do, then return it. It was a very unique situation. I've never seen anything like that between a museum and a tribal group other than that. And
that was at Fort Sill?
Yeah.
Wow.
Under Spivey. Do you remember Mr. Spivey? He was the
yes, I do actually.
Yeah, he was the Old Post Museum director. Yeah. He was the one that did that. He was a pretty good guy. Pretty good curator.
Yeah, I mean, and just to contextualize, I mean, I think you all get what she's saying. Fort Sill was where a lot of Native people were incarcerated as political prisoners, and a lot of them died there. And so there's all these, these prisons. And I don't know what other collections are out there, but I just remember that there's a lot of people buried there.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of people buried there. There is the Old Post collection, which is a lot of livery from the cavalry, things of that nature. They still do the annual 19th century baseball game, though, between the Indians and the Army guys, and we still win every year.
I have no idea, man. Yeah.
There's a lot of strange little traditions down there, but they have a good relationship with the tribes for the most part, which is amazing given the history, you know, all the sorrow that's there.
Do we have any additional questions? Let's see.
We do have a couple of questions. We had a question about, Winona succinctly said the museums just kind of need to give everything back and give it up. But we have some questions around, are there ways for museums to still display things? So displaying a replica.
Right, that was a good question, and I actually approached the Berry Museum about that with that collection of 250 clothing items from the Wounded Knee Massacre. And my suggestion to them is that they should give the items back and they should commission the Oglalas to make replicas, you know, for a huge amount of money, you know, but that would be the way to solve that. And that is really the solution that you need. Is if they want something like it, then be proud, you know, get the money to have somebody make a replica, you know, and I mean that's the ethical practice, and return it. And so that was a really good question, Professor King, and I think that they did nothing with that suggestion. Of course, you know, I was just like, you know, trying to give her a little idea on how to get out of that really bad karma of holding all those people's stuff for so long.
Exactly. You know, one thing is that with the 3D printers now, I worry about that. That's a new worry for me, is that some museums may replicate things without our knowledge, without consultation, and then they'll return the object, but there still should be consultation, and I think any replicas should be made by tribal members, should be made by our artists and artisans, and not printed up on a 3D printer. So that's another fear phobia I'm starting to develop, was that really made by a human, that kind of thing.
You know, and I see one of the questions on the museums telling you that we could keep it better. Well, you know, I mean, that's such a patronizing, so patronizing. And I do understand that they have all these special vaults and special, you know,
climate control.
Had to get special stuff when we got back some of our items. I'm saying that you're all in the museum business, you know what I mean? Like air, like certain special stuff.
Yeah.
But they, you know, so our tribe has like a room in the tribal offices where our things that need that are kept. But to suggest that we keep better care of it after we've formaldehyded them and made them super toxic, and those items are items that need to be feasted or worn or danced, that is not good care of them. You know, that is not good care of them, you know.
I was also thinking of just objects that are so sacred, even with a replica, they just should not be consumed for like visual consumption outside of its use, right? Yes. So I think that part of many collections is part of the ethics that is really missing as well. There's just objects that no one else really needs to know about. Oh. If they're sacred objects and used in a particular way, then let them live the way they're supposed to live, so to speak.
And let them be cared for by the people that know how to care for them.
Yeah. I know some conservation techniques have been shifting, not in all museums, but they have been shifting in terms of taking into account the way those objects embody life. So if they're meant to be with other sort of feminine objects, they are kept with other feminine objects, versus, you know, next to something else from a completely different part of the world or different type of object whatsoever. But I still think that that's in the infancy stages of change. I think you can see that probably in the larger museums or in the very small museums that may have a good relationship with the indigenous nations that they are working with. But it's probably few and far between. We have a whole bunch of other questions in here. Where are we, Rosamond?
Well, one key question, since we have a lot of students in the room, is does anyone know of internships or training programs for students who are interested in getting into this, into learning more about NAGPRA and working with tribal objects? And then there's a question around how many museums are in compliance with NAGPRA and how many are breaking the law because they're not in compliance, and what kind of federal funding exists for Indigenous museums and how that funding might be decided.
Good questions.
You want to go, Winona, or you want me to?
You go.
There are not a lot of programs for internships for natives. There may be some written particularly through specific museums. I don't think I have seen any recently. Gearing yourself toward this, there's no training for NAGPRA within most colleges, which is something that I think needs to change. I think there should be classes on NAGPRA, how it's conducted, what the law entails. I also think that it should be paired with an ethics course. They go hand in hand here. There are a lot of museums who are not in compliance. Most of them have turned in cursory inventories. But as far as actually working toward being in compliance, they're dragging their feet. There's a really notorious problem on the West Coast at a university museum that shall remain nameless, but if you're following anything, you know who I'm talking about. And this is, we got a long way to go. We are 30 years in and only 30% of the work's been done. So we need people that truly want to do this work. There's no reason to study our ancestors any longer. They need to be brought home. We're also moving into a period where we need to look at all folks, all humans that are in museums in these femur-sized boxes, because there's a great number of not just our Indigenous brothers and sisters, but our African-American brothers and sisters. There's a lot of folks in these museums, and there's no need for this anymore. We don't have to do, we've answered the questions. So I wish there were internships. I think we can start lobbying colleges and maybe lobbying departments, seeing what we can do. You're the lobbyist, ma'am. What do you think, Winona?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that there needs to be a lot more resources in this, and figuring out how to make sure that those resources get to, these communities to take care of things well. I mean, there's certainly under the present administration, there's no interest in any of this, but the long term, like what does reconciliation look like? What does restorative justice look like? Those things are addressed in tangible forms.
Yeah.
And that's what we want. That's what we need to see, is that transition.
Yes. I want to see students, and I'm so thrilled that there are students interested in doing this work, because quite frankly, most of us that end up being NAGPRA representatives or NAGPRA officers, we kind of inadvertently land here. All of my training is in Indigenous material culture, with the aspect of trying to take care of it, maintaining it, interpreting it, and getting it back to people. I just kind of got tossed into the human remains side of things, but thankfully I came out of a four-fielded background, so I was trained in osteology and biology to the extent enough that I can do that work. There is another thing, Winona, you probably know this as well, that there are some Indian folks that they don't look upon their deceased. They don't want to go, they cannot, because of tribal beliefs, cultural beliefs, they cannot go in and do this kind of work with those ancestors' remains. So this is where anyone interested in getting into this work for Native communities, you would be so beneficial to some of these smaller communities or strict communities that don't do this. That don't repatriate because it's taboo for them to look upon their deceased.
Yeah, I mean, when I first was writing about this in my book, Last Standing Woman, which is my novel, I interviewed one of our spiritual leaders. I said, what you call that ceremony when you bring them back? We had to make up a ceremony, because you don't have why would you dig them up?
Right. Right.
And so we had to make a whole new ceremony, and he said it's called the Sending Them Off Again ceremony. It's just to me, you spend all this time trying to sort out how to undo this mess,
Yes.
But I remember he's but he's done a lot of them, he's done a lot of those ceremonies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is.
See.
Caribbean. Oh, I wish.
And we have a question from an art history professor about the best way to approach teaching Native American art in an art history survey course with respect and with accuracy.
Good question.
Very good question.
Well, I mean, there's all kinds of, great writing and great books on it. And then, there's not an easy answer. I mean, I gave yesterday, I believe it was, I gave my really short art history class, but trying to span both contextualizing, I think is really important. Ledger art is so, collected and revered. And I'm those people were in really tormented prisons when they did that art, and to really understand the transition and then, to kind of give the context. And then also I think that, a lot of our art is wearable. We don't put up stuff on walls. That's not my community. We wear our, we wear our work,
Oop, Nicole, I think you're on mute.
Yes, Uncas was throwing a fit, so I had to mute. I have a very large, ill-tempered, or sadly tempered dog. He's a big baby. So much of what we have, our material culture is what we wear or what we use daily. It's difficult to. That's why I like the idea of replicating, because it teaches a younger generation, especially if they strive to do it the way it was done by our ancestors. It perpetuates that knowledge and skill that so many people, we see it in our bead work, we see it in quill work, but when I see it in wood carving and art and things of that nature, it really, really makes me happy for them, because they're doing something that has been passed down. This is particular to them and maybe their family or their clan or whatever.
Yeah, I was thinking of this question from Rachel about how culture changes me. I mean, for a lot, you're kind of in the middle of it, so you don't really know it being another being. I don't know. Does that make sense? I just know who I am, and I am in this culture, and I'm this person. Has my culture changed me? I'm formed by it, and then, and then in part, what I wanted to kind of refer back to the artisan work of our regalia is that a lot of times, to honor your work, you dance your work, you dance your best pieces, and if they're to be danced. And so I think that there's been a lot of, obviously, you know, museums are full of the work of white men who had patrons and painted, you know, and the valuation of women and their work, you know, is seen more like crafty, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that there's this whole, you know, I mean, obviously a lack of valuation and an understanding for sure on how people view art, because not everybody, you know, it's very, you know, European privileged to view art as something you put on a wall or make a statue to your, you know, favorite uncle.
Yeah. Ours has always been more practical, and more meaningful for a greater, well, dancing is praying. And when we dress to dance, that's part of the culture altogether. It's that big mishmash. Would you like to introduce yourself so you'll be quiet?
Let's see, do we have any other additional questions or comments?
Yeah, I'm just trying to read the side here.
Yeah, it's hard to read, and
Yeah.
it definitely takes a skill set to do the Zoom.
Well,
Yeah.
there's good answers there, Professor King. You gave him an answer on the curatorial field. That's very good, you know.
Awesome.
I think it's just really amazing how resourceful, you know. Yeah, the Mille Museum is really a good example. I've done a lot of events there. I like that they, you know, because, and I even, you know, I mean, because we're making history now, and I want to have like the art of our resistance valued by museums.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because art and culture are vital living things. They aren't only historic. And you know, so that's been, you know, some of these museums have been very good, you know, in Minnesota on that. But I still go back to the need to keep pushing these museums to, you know, certainly to become more multiracial. Like, I actually don't have the answer to where the Walker Museum got to in kind of like deconstructing the race and privilege of you know, I mean, it was really like if you put a model gas chamber up just so people could see it, you know, and I mean, that's what it was like. And I was like, how could you do that? You know, how could you do that as a museum and just say, you know, it's just art, you know? So I'm hoping that that Walker has moved a little bit. That curator lost her job, but you know, a lot more should happen to transition that these things, these unthinkable collections, you know, we begin to get well, you know. And then I think that I don't know, maybe Nicole, you know, but like as we bring home our things, like a lot of times we have a feast for them and all. And I think that, you know, maybe, I mean, it's not my call, but if a community, I'm sure some of these communities have involved the museums from which had held them.
Yes.
In saying, come see us, come see what we have done, you know.
We have, we did a repatriation of 80, I believe it was 83 folks in, at Schönbrunn Village in Ohio, which was once a Lenape Moravian village for a few years before the frontier broke loose. And we had, of course, it's a little reconstructed village from the 18th century. And after we did the reinterment, we had a traditional meal that was cooked there by our ladies from the 3 different groups, because we tend to, our tribes tend to, we work together on repatriations. It's the Delaware Nation, the Delaware Tribe of Indians, and the Stockbridge Munsee community that we collaborate. So we would have a meal afterwards of traditional food, you know, all the biggies, corn, beans, squash, fried bread, of course. So it gives you a sense of community. We did invite the folks from the museums that had worked with us to be there. and tribal representatives. That's usually, particularly for us being a removal tribe, it was always kind of difficult to bring a lot of tribal members because we're traveling to the Midwest to do these things from Oklahoma, and the expense would be, can get great. But there are travel grants available through National NAGPRA to facilitate these kind of things. It's so important to, when you're working on repatriations, you have to be looking at not only where am I going to reinter these people, how am I going to do this, who's going to do the bundling. There is so much, and planning the meals, planning the travel, making those, suggesting selections for who travels. It is a very involved, long process, and it takes a lot of organization and juggling to get it done, but it is one of the most fulfilling things you'll ever do. I think, even if you were not a tribal member and just doing this work for a tribe, I can guarantee you from a colleague of mine who does this, it is extremely fulfilling. And human beings just do not belong in museums, not in the physical sense, unless they're walking through looking at an exhibit.
Good points. Before we sort of start to close, since we only have a few more minutes, I was wondering if, Winona, if you have any last thoughts or words or anything else you want to share on this topic, as well as Nicole.
First, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. My experience is far more limited, but it is also very community-based, looking for things that I was like, where did they go? And then you had to go on this long odyssey to find them, and Andover, Phillips Andover Academy had a bunch of our greatest wealth, spiritual wealth. I mean, who would know, that the Phillips Andover, prep school had them, or, so for our community, it's been a really good, we've reclaimed much, and we're not well yet, but we are singing with our drums, and that's a good start. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about that, our lives and the rematriation of our relatives.
Thank you. Nicole, did you want to close out with any thoughts?
I wanted to thank you for this opportunity. It really has meant a lot to me, and I do want to encourage you all, if this is something you think you would be interested in pursuing this kind of work, please do so. As an independent consultant now, I miss working for my people, but now I am able to help all my Indian brothers and sisters. And that's a good thing, because I would do this work for any tribe that wanted it done. And I think it's good to have something solid and meaningful in a world that's so chaotic and crazy. And this is very meaningful work. It gives you a good sense of self and balance and what's important. And I really appreciated this opportunity and the opportunity to get to meet Winona and to see my friend Kelly. And thank you very much.
Thank you both. This has been such an amazing experience. I think I can speak for myself, but also for others. I've been in these events all week. And as this is the last event of the week, the gratitude just needs to flow to everyone here, but particularly Winona. Your words have been extremely inspiring. Now I'm going to tear up, so that's not good. It's been an inspiring week, and my students, I had them all have to submit discussion points before this 11 o'clock class, and so many of them were about how they watched the video of Winona and Naomi Klein at the Rubin Museum talking about environmental justice and the Green New Deal. And just the inspiration that just watching you on video and talking about such important aspects of the world and change that needs to be done, it's just been really lovely. I'll just state that they've really been inspired, and we have a large group of activists here on campus, and so I think you've really really helped inspire them to continue their quests. So I have to say thank you for that. And thank you for everyone, particularly for Rosamond and Suklima for managing all this, and for all that participated here, all the students, all the faculty, all the staff, all the friends. There's many friends out here in the audience as well. My two classes, my intro to archaeology as well as my museum class, are going to stay on until about 1, so that we can have a little bit of conversation more with Nicole. If anyone else wants to stay on and continue this discussion, it's fine. We're just going to follow up on some more particular points. But I just want to thank everyone for being here today, for the events this week, for bringing some really amazing topics to the discussion, and pushing all of these points that were made this week forward in a new direction. So thank you.
Miigwech.
Miigwech. The Muppet wave, right?
Yes, thank you everyone. So if you're not staying for class, please log off so that class can continue. Thank you so much.